Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to have you join us here for this session on study abroad and employability. I first just want to recognize that the sponsor for this theme is Go India, so we appreciate their sponsorship and allowing us to bring you this session here today, as along with all of the other wonderful information we've been sharing on this topic throughout the conference. So today I'm very happy to have a terrific panel assembled talking about the theme of study abroad and employability and the connection between the two. I'm Christine. And Maggie Becker from Worcester Polytechnic Institute to give us the institutional perspective on this. So without further ado, we'll get started. So I'm going to be sharing with you information about a study that IIE conducted through Generation Study Abroad called Gaining an Employment Edge. And we have just released the study today. You may have heard about it already at the conference. So I'll be sharing with you some findings from the study and then looking forward to having a conversation towards the end of the session. And along with all the other great information we'll be hearing from everybody else on the panel. So I first just want to give you some information, an overview of the study. And our study really was intended to look at does study abroad impact employment and career development? And there's a lot of other studies out there that do show a connection, but we wanted to go beyond what has been done before. Often they're program-based studies or evaluation of smaller scale programs, and we wanted to take this national. So we conducted a national study of U.S. study abroad students who had gone abroad between 99 and 99 in the present day. And then we also wanted to look not only at is there a connection, but how does study abroad contribute to a positive impact on careers? What components of a study abroad program help to develop a positive career impact down the road? So we conducted a national survey. We worked with many partners, including AIFS, who's here today, to help distribute this study. We received around 4,500 responses from around the US. And then we also conducted some in-depth interviews so that we could really get a better sense and a deeper sense of how study abroad contributes to positive employment outcomes. So we focused the study around a few key areas, and one of the key areas being the development of workforce skills. So this just gives you a sense of the different workforce skills that we looked at, grouped into different types. We looked at the intrapersonal, sort of the personal kinds of skills, such as work ethic and self-awareness, intercultural skills, the cognitive skills like problem solving, and then interpersonal skills, working with other people through communications, teamwork, and leadership. And we really, our position with this was that we developed this list of skills that we looked at, looking at sort of the employment literature and the workforce literature. So I'll move on to key findings. What we found is that study abroad has a positive impact on most of these skills that we looked at. We looked at 15 overall, and we found that 14 of the 15 were alumni reported positive skill gains. And actually 11 of the 15 were actually pretty high, where alumni reported high rates of skill gains. I will note that there's one area, technical and software skills, that we looked at where participants didn't really gain skills through study abroad. And the reason for this is that usually study abroad programs don't have this as a focus. So they're not really structured to gain technical or computer skills through those through study abroad. Some other skills that we looked at were work ethic, teamwork, and leadership. And those are three skills that were less highly developed than the others. I'll talk about that a little more later on, because there were some types of programs that did help to develop these skills, but overall they were a little less highly developed than most of the other skills we looked at. The other finding is that a longer period of study abroad tended to have a higher impact on job offers. So we asked survey participants whether they felt that study abroad helped to lead to a job offer down the road. And what we found with this is you see with, if somebody had gone on a short-term experience, about 43% of them thought that study abroad led to a job offer. And those numbers increased as the study abroad went up in duration. And largely this was a function often of the fact that longer-term study abroad students tended to gain foreign language skills and communication skills to a higher degree, and were able to make that more direct connection between a job offer down the line. Now, where short-term programs come in is that it's not just about longer-term study abroad leading to higher rates of a job offer, but we did find that short-term programs offered some advantages that longer-term programs don't. So essentially, shorter-term programs are actually a bit more effective at creating those leadership, positive teamwork outcomes. So this was a small advantage, but very highly significant, so that the shorter-term programs were really more effective at helping students gain those teamwork skills that they needed in the workforce. And in terms of the study abroad impact on program length, as I mentioned before, the longer-term programs tended to better develop foreign language and communication skills. So that's really where the longer-term programs come into play in their advantage for positive career impacts. And then lastly, there were a few skills like curiosity, work ethic, and leadership, where there wasn't really a very strong correlation between program length and how well those skills were developed. So these skills were developed, there wasn't any strong advantage by studying abroad for a longer period. The next key takeaway is that skills gained from study abroad have a long-term impact on career progression. I mentioned before, one thing we looked at is whether study abroad led to a job offer. But what we found is that even with students who didn't see a clear connection between their study abroad experience and a firm offer of employment, they used their skills on the job. So we were looking at people who had studied abroad as long ago as 2000. They've been in the workforce for many years. So by and large, most participants said the skills I learned I use in my job. And even for those who didn't see necessarily that study abroad led to a job offer, perhaps right after graduation, they did note that the skills that they learned helped them get promoted. It helped them advance in their careers. It really gave them sort of the interpersonal skills, the communication and skills that they needed to set them apart from others in their field as they moved up in their careers and in their fields to start managing teams and working with teams. And so here's a great quote that from one of our study participants that sort of demonstrates how this has a positive impact. And this person said, "I manage cross-functional teams at work. So figuring out and kind of getting to know them as people and understanding what makes them work the way they do has helped me to create a better end product." So this person was, making that clear connection between being able to better manage people and understand people because of the skills that they learned through study abroad. Now, study abroad also expands career possibilities. And there's a couple of ways that, that study participants reported that this happened. And I'll share again a couple of great quotes because I think these are so really capture what we're looking at here. And this first person said, a business major who now works in manufacturing, said that they had a 3.9 GPA, interviewed for 5 different internship positions before they went abroad, didn't get any of those positions, but then they went abroad, had 2 interviews after they came back, and then got both of those, were offered both positions right away. And during their whole interview, they talked about their study abroad experience, and that really helped to set them apart and give them that, that edge to get that internship that they were looking for. And then the next quote we have really talks more about confidence. So this person says, "I think that study abroad gave me a lot of confidence in moving into positions that I want. It's been more beneficial than anything, that they haven't really been scared of anything, that they're not scared of the unknown because they had that study abroad experience that gave them the confidence to deal with with new situations and take on new tasks. So they were, again, this person was really making the clear connection between the study abroad experience leading to that sort of confidence and ability to take on new tasks and new positions in their career. Now here's another sort of surprising finding that we didn't go out looking for, but we did find in our analysis, is that STEM majors who study abroad in fields outside of STEM had particularly high gains in terms of a career impact. So when we asked, did study abroad contribute to a job offer, STEM majors who studied in science when they were abroad, only about a quarter of them saw a connection between their study abroad experience and the job offer. But about half of them who studied outside of the science fields saw that connection. So there was a real big impact there. And the reason for that, and this quote really sums that up nicely, is that this participant said generally in the sciences, communication isn't really emphasized, especially intercultural communication. That's not something I'd be able to learn in the classroom, but it was something I was able to learn through study abroad. So, over and again, science majors did indicate that their study abroad experience gave them something that their more formal sort of science structured curricula at home didn't give them, that helped set them apart from other candidates in their field when they were actually looking for jobs after graduation. And the next finding is that different destinations have a big impact. And so what I mean by this, by different destinations, it really depends on who the individual is, but a different destination is something where, a place where the student was not already familiar. So this could vary by individual. So really it's an unexplored, culturally different location than what the person already knows. And what we found is that for students who purposely sought out a different destination, they were better able to articulate the impact of their study abroad on the skill development and the usefulness in their career down the line. So here's an interesting quote that illustrates that. So for this person who studied abroad in Brazil, said that it was important to go somewhere that was in a foreign language, that their school had a program in the UK, but they didn't want to do that. I didn't feel like it was going to push me enough. What promoted the skill development was experiencing the different culture and being in that different environment. So really, pushing beyond the boundaries of what you already know. And I'll just emphasize again that, this example is, want to sort of go beyond our usual use of the term non-traditional or traditional destinations, where traditional is, in Europe and non-traditional is elsewhere. That doesn't really come into play here. We had, study participants, for example, one who had family in South America, so was very familiar with South America and wanted to go to Europe to really have that different experience. So it really depends on the individual, what they already know, and going to somewhere new and different. That's really where we saw this bigger career impact. And then the last key finding I want to leave the audience with is the impact of program goals and program structure on positive career outcomes. So when the student has a career prospect in mind when they are embarking on their study abroad experience, we found that they were better able to articulate their skill development while they went abroad. They were better able to articulate their career impact, and that they were more likely to study abroad in a highly structured program. So that students who were seeking these career impacts tended to go on programs that would give them those skills that they were looking for. And those highly structured programs often focused on skills like collaboration, interpersonal skills, teamwork, and leadership. So this is really where we saw the impact. So it's not just about articulating to employers after the fact, once you've gone on study abroad, but that big career impacts are found when there's clear goals, so that the students are setting clear goals, or perhaps the programs are setting clear goals for a positive skill development through study abroad, and actually structuring those programs to help produce those outcomes. So I'll leave you with just some final recommendations based from the study. First, that it is important to help students, coach them how to effectively communicate the skills they learn through study abroad. It's not enough just to know what you've learned through study abroad, but that most of the participants that we talked to actually were the ones to raise their study abroad experience during their job interviews. So even if an employer doesn't ask about it, students need to know how to articulate what they've learned and translate the value of that for employers. And as I already mentioned, it's important to integrate career-related learning outcomes into the development of programs, because when students are able to identify what career skills they're going to learn in a study abroad program and then choose their programs accordingly, they can more seamlessly, identify whether they've learned them and how those skills are useful for employers when they go on the job market. And then it's important to leverage short-term programs and the value that they have in developing teamwork skills. And really, it's important to offer a range of different kinds of study abroad programs, because we found that short-term short-term programs are better at developing teamwork skills. Longer-term programs are more valuable for developing foreign language skills. And these kinds of skills are all valuable for employers, but it really depends on what the student's own goals are and the field for which they hope to study or work in the future. And then it's also important to help students, to encourage them to study in a place that they're not familiar with, so something different, something new, because they really gain a lot when they do that. And then lastly, increase STEM student participation in study abroad. And I think that's something a lot of us are focused on, but particularly in fields outside of STEM, there's a big value there as well. So I've just given you the highlights. We have actually a very detailed report. If you haven't looked at it, I encourage you to look at the website if you'd like to read the full report and get more details, and then we can talk more later as well. So now I will turn it over to Marty.
Thanks. I guess, how many of you were at the last summit? Oh, good, only a small number. Then I'm going to read some remarks later from the TED Talk, the 6-minute talk I gave at that summit, which bears on a lot of what we're going to talk about here. So to start, I've done a little wordplay here, and I've written a piece with that title, that research bolsters the value proposition that employability strengthens education abroad. Now, I use the term employability. I'm not talking, and I don't usually write about employment. For me, it's a really critical distinction to be made about when you talk about the value of study abroad or education abroad, any form of experiential learning internationally. Most researchers want to talk about the gains in skills and competencies through that particular type of experiential learning outside the United States. And the accumulation of those skills and competencies taken together is what's usually called gains in employability. Employability meaning the toolkit that students will build out of a particular kind of international experience. And that's not the same thing as talking about whether building those skills and competencies in and of itself is what determines whether or not and how quickly a student would be employed upon graduation. It's not the same thing. So I'm very careful and very cautious about that, because there's very little research that actually points to a causal relationship between having international experience per se and being employed after a student graduates. But there's a lot of correlation in research that's been clearly demonstrated both here and in Australia, and particularly in the EU, that gains in employability skills is really what, if articulated properly, will provide the advantage for a student to be more quickly employed. That's why you see all of those studies. Well, within 6 months after graduation, or within a year after graduation, and so forth and so on. But it's not to say that it's an absolute consequence of having international experience. And therefore, so the question here for me is, so are our graduates prepared? It's a mixed bag nationally. They are, kind of, but we all know there are advantages depending on the background, the socioeconomic background of the individual students we're talking about, the brand, the name of the institution that we're talking about, where they attended, and that gets complicated. It's all about the alumni networks, the resources of the institution applied to career services, and overall to internationalization itself. By and large in the United States, most advising that goes on campuses is highly under-resourced, with the exception of many institutions that we all know the name of. But given the thousands of institutions we have, by and large, most just do not have sufficient funds to support students in a way that would be helpful for them when they are going on an international experience. And therefore, what that leads to is often the fact that students are just, because of this vastly divergent way in which they receive advising about the value added of going abroad, they often are unable to connect the dots about that value. And the trend that is very evident is that skills and competencies matter more than major. And there's been recent research about this with them on the employer side, showcasing that most, I don't know, I would have been interested to hear our friends from IBM talk about it this morning, and the other gentleman from the Latin American company. You know, when they're hiring, do they really pay more attention to the major and the coursework of an applicant, a new applicant, or is it something else that they're looking for when it comes to particular skills and competencies and how those were accrued for the student? So this is a mixed bag. Now, this is a study, I've written about this, it came out last year. It's called Going Global. I'd urge you to kind of check it out. It's very, very interesting, complementary survey work to what IIE has done. This was only with about 1,000 students. It's put together by Kaplan in concert with The Economist. And so the findings here, as you see, of that survey group, 75% of the respondents at their institutions had access to ed abroad, but only 34% went. And of the cohort that they surveyed, 50% of those students failed to recognize the importance of the experience going abroad during their study period. However, those with international experience were 2 times as likely to be employed within the 6 months after graduation. So, you know, sort of in reverse, going backwards, I mean, I think there needs to just be, I think it would be very helpful for students to be much more clear about this issue of the value added of their considering whether or not to have an international experience. I'm an old school kind of guy, and when I went in the 70s, you know, it was that time, 60s and 70s, in that era, you know, saying it was great was sufficient. I mean, no, there wasn't a great demand to go much more into depth about what happened. You went, it was pretty astounding, and so forth and so on. And that's why now we still have the conferences that go on about, you know, after, so what, it was great, what happens, what has really happened for the student. And I think that the value proposition has to be looked at much more carefully. And as a result of that, the challenge for you is how to close this, what I refer to as this employability gap. And what I mean by that is that there is a gap between what students think will lead to employment after graduation and how employers perceive their readiness to enter the workforce. It's existed for a long time, but I think the gap is growing wider. I think there's an absolute necessity for campuses to cross-train staff in both the career and study abroad offices. When you're hired to be a career service advisor, whether or not you have international experience may or may not be relevant. You know, you want a master's degree in counseling, psychology, et cetera, et cetera. And conversely, when you're looking to work in a study abroad office, you couldn't possibly get that job absent having international experience. So you have one group of student affairs personnel who get what it means to have international experience, and on the other hand, a critical office where the personnel in that office may or may not fully appreciate it because they haven't had that in their own life necessarily. Same thing with employers. They didn't talk about that this morning, but there's a big difference between hiring managers interviewing a student who's studied abroad, who themselves have studied abroad, versus the hiring managers who have not studied abroad. Huge gap in how they interpret what they are listening to. Employers generally feel campuses are not preparing grads with the skills and competencies they need. I think there's a continuing need for campuses to be more actively engaged with the workforce population their students are seeking to enter into. And the gap there on campuses, and I did this at SAIS, I had a portfolio of employers here in Washington that I was personally responsible for, building networks with alumni and so forth. That's what career service professionals are judged on, the basis on which they are good at that. It has nothing to do with what we judge competence in running a student affairs, study abroad office. You know, and these two offices are kind of passing each other in that regard. You know, if you're going to be in study abroad trying to make this case, but you've never really, apart from your own interview to get the job at the campus you're working at, you've really never had a lot of exposure to this whole human resource situation, everything that was talked about this morning. And it's only happening in the career office, right? But what I've always been talking about is the need for students to be advised to spend time in both offices on any campus. Both offices complementing the questions that students have. So closing the gap means teaching students how to leverage skills and competencies that they have developed during their study abroad time. It requires a concerted effort to devote resources to devise an integrated or harmonized approach to advising on campus. And then it includes the purposeful design of ed abroad programs so that the learning outcomes you hope for students to achieve are built into the design of the program. You can't have you won't have success at what you want to achieve if you don't design the program to maximize the opportunity for students to get there. So when students come back, if it's the first time that they're being asked questions about, well, talk about, you know, the kinds of things we've already been talking about here, asking students purposeful questions about how they grew, how they learned, what was the most valuable element in terms of risks they took abroad. If students are not made aware of the fact that those are questions they're going to be having to answer through the experience, it only pops up in the return to campus unpacking, right, for the first time, it's a missed opportunity for students. Completely missed opportunity that way. So I'm going to stop right there because I hope maybe what I've said then will lead to my colleague Ann and what she's going to unpack a little bit in more detail for you guys.
All right. So my name is Ann Hubbard, and I work at AIFS Study Abroad. I've been there for about 6 years, and prior to that I was in a study abroad office on a U.S. campus for many years. I'm responsible for assessment initiatives at AIFS, and we have a very large alumni survey that is ongoing, and we're going to have a same subject longitudinal study here that we're in the process of analyzing the data. But our study from 5 years ago, we have some copies at our table, and we categorized our data into personal growth and development, intercultural and global awareness, and career and professional development. So we have a career track of data in this study. I'm also a doctoral candidate in higher education internationalization, and my topic is actually assessing those sessions, the intervention sessions, if you will, that get done upon a return from study abroad to see if we can help students better articulate their experience. You know, it's a hard thing to, on command, come up with the woman this morning said, you know, do you have a compelling story? You know, can you demonstrate your skill by telling a compelling story? It doesn't happen on command, that's for sure. Anyway, let's have a look. So, you know, we've been hearing different things about what employers say. I think the thing that is important to look at is that the U.S. studies, so AAC&U, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, for example, and perhaps the NACE study, those employers, they value the skills that we talk about are an outcome of study abroad, but they don't necessarily rate study abroad as something that they're looking for. So there seems to be a disconnect. And I've had some discussion with my colleagues in career services about this, and just like Marty said, it depends on the individual. Do they value it, do they not, however that is. The other thing I do believe is that I see, obviously, like the British Council study is really a global focus, as is the QS study, if you're familiar with that, really big multinationals. And there's definitely a regard there for the wish to have strong international experience. But the US studies, while they don't say they value study abroad, but yet they value the skills, I would also argue that the Erasmus Impact Study, the most recent one, there's indication there that employers are a little more keen on the fact that, if students have study abroad experience. And Marty and I have had discussions about that and the fact that, there's just in closer proximity and they're more, it's sort of typical. And in the US, you really could remain rather isolated without needing to think about too much about international, if you will. I know that sounds crazy, but you know what I mean, relatively speaking. So let's take a look. So this is an example of, one of the AAC&U studies, of they would be more likely to consider hiring a recent graduate if they had these skills and experiences. And study abroad rates really low in this kind of study. This isn't the only one where we see this. But yet in this study, where they're talking to several hundred employers, meanwhile the employers are saying, well, we're scanning resumes for the evidence of ability to work on a team, problem-solving skills, and flexibility and adaptability. And we know that those are skills that students respond really strongly to in terms of returning from abroad. So again, that sort of disconnect. And I think, our role in the field, if we're ever really going to get the credibility that we want, we would really still have a lot of work ahead of us. One of the things that I've come upon in looking at a number of employer surveys is this concept of there's really a strong preference and a really high value on this ability to work in a team and in a diverse workplace setting. So in our AIFS alumni survey, 5 years ago when we ran it and we were surveying students from over a 20-year period, 1990 to 2010, 80% of them said that studying abroad contributed to my ability to adapt in diverse workplace settings. And in our most recent set of data, with alumni of the past 5 years, that actually climbed to 86%. And that's a great statistic, but the fact is that we don't really know how those students are behaving, right? And so I'm trying to spend some time on that. What does that mean? And how do we try to take learning in a single culture, in a culture-specific setting, and help students make that leap to how do we function in one other culture? Well, how is that going to help us in a third culture or in a fourth culture, in more that culture general load? And I've also been trying to look at that idea of, why diversity? I mean, obviously employers are facing the fact that they have diverse teams, but I've been reading research on, that diversity actually results. There's an article I have out of Harvard Business Review, and it's diverse teams feel less comfortable, and that's why they perform better. And so whenever you add that element of, how are we going to work with this other, it actually increases. Like there were groups that once they were more diverse, they were actually more able to, solve a problem or get the information that they wanted. But this sort of fascinated me, and why? Why do we have to pay attention to that, and how do we help students learn that that's important? Oh, what did I do? There we go. Another thing, and I'm sure you're all familiar, but if we look at the skills that employers talk about as transferable skills and maybe they're soft skills or however we want to call them, And we look at what's being defined as intercultural competence and what are the skills that define intercultural competence. I see it as, in the middle, we have this big overlap, really big overlap. And if we can help students talk about the overlap, it really doesn't matter whether it's for international use or wherever it is. It's really important skill set to have. And how do we bring that into the sort of awareness of students, the awareness of employers, that these are, we're not talking about two really different things here. That intercultural set is really important, and it comes up all the time on this list of coveted transferable skills. So there's an article from the Frontiers Journal, the peer-reviewed journal by the Forum on Education Abroad from 10 years ago, Employer Attitudes Towards Study Abroad. And, in short, studying abroad is not in and of itself a way to get a job. But there's 3 recommendations that came out of this 10 years ago, and let's take a look. So that we develop study abroad programs that help build the desired skills, that we carry out research, that we continue to do that so we can help convince employers, and that we try to give students training in how to talk about what they've learned, and this is the really key clause, in ways that employers will appreciate. And I think we've made some progress, probably in all 3 of these. But clearly we're sitting here, so we have more work to do. We still have work to do. I have to point out, so in the first one, develop study abroad programs that build desired skills, I was recently sitting with a campus career counselor, and she had a graduate intern with her, and he said to me, well, what about introducing that idea of skills before a student goes abroad? And in this article, that's really not what they were talking about. And I was trying to explain to this graduate student that 10 years ago, that's where we were. And now that we've come to say, well, we probably need to introduce this earlier on, that is in some ways progress that we've made in the last 10 years. He was like astounded that we wouldn't have thought about that 10 years ago. I was trying to explain to him. Anyway, we really have made progress. And on the other hand, in some of the research I'm doing, students don't rate, wanting to enhance their resume or building career skills as high as their motivation for study abroad and wanting to learn about another culture and wanting to travel. And you know what? I think that's okay. I think that's really okay. And it doesn't necessarily need to be 2 separate things. But we were all 20 or 21 a time ago, and it's attractive to us to say, well, you can go and travel and learn about another culture. And then we can, once we get them to go, then we can introduce to them that, there's some skills that you can build here that are really, really important. And so I think that it's okay to not be so overly focused. I think I want to see a little bit of balance in how we present it to students. Go ahead.
All right, hello everyone. Can you hear me okay? So my name's Maggie Docker, and I am the Director of Career Services and Professional Practice. So I come from the Career Development Center world. I've been at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, or WPI as you'll hear me refer to it, just about 10 years now. And so WPI is a little bit of a unique institution when it comes to our study abroad and study away programs. And so I just want to make sure that I make note of that, and then talk really about how we work very closely with our International Global Studies division that supports our students' experiences off campus. So we do global learning at WPI. So our undergraduate student population is about 4,300 students, and every student is required to do projects. So we have 4 7-week terms. Students will do what's equivalent to 3 courses each term. A project would be 3 courses in length. And all of our junior year students will do an off-campus or on-campus interactive qualifying project. Our goal is for 90% of our students to do that off-campus, throughout our 50 project centers domestically and 25 overseas. And in the class of 2022 we're excited to announce that all 100% of that class will receive scholarships to help them study, or to rather do their project off campus. So when our students are doing these projects off campus, they're working in a team, and they're working for nonprofits, NGOs, government agencies, etc., to deliver a project that helps that organization. They work on interdisciplinary teams of about 4 students or so, and then they go off-site with a few other teams of students and a faculty or 2 as a project center director. And when they go on these projects, the term before they go away, they do a class that helps prepare them by learning more about the culture, the language, a little bit about the projects they'll be working on, and a lot of team dynamics. And so we do have some other programs as well. Our first year students are doing great problem seminars where they're looking at assessing different global challenges, such as the world's water, or other topics around healthcare and education, etc. So what I do when I joined WPI, one of the first things that I do, and now I have my team do, is make sure that we go to project presentation day. We go to the Global Projects Fair. We also interview students to get a better understanding of what project experience looks like at WPI and what our off-campus or study away experiences are actually like. I oversee the peer advisor program for my office, which delivers workshops and programs, and I always have had at least 1 or 2 students at all times that have done an off-campus overseas experience to be able to help work closely with our partners in our International and Global Studies Division, or IGSD, which I'll refer to from here on out. And one of the things that one of my colleagues developed was we took NACE's top 10 skills that employers are looking for. And what we did was we printed them on cardstock and laminated them. And then we would meet with students that have returned from their experience and their reflection conversation afterwards, or even in other workshops. And we'll ask students, first, rank the order you think employers are looking for. And then we reveal what the top 10 skills our employers are looking for. And we ask them a little bit about why they think that is. And our students, considering WPI is a STEM-focused institution, we do have a School of Engineering, Arts and Sciences, and Business. They're always surprised to see technical skills so low, but we have a great conversation that by now, that's expected. All these other things are what is going to really set you apart. Then we ask students to get into small groups with, most of the time it's students that didn't study away with them. And we ask them, we'll give them one of those top 10 skills and say, okay, brainstorm all the things you did on your project and your overseas experience that support that skill set. So, for example, communicating verbally with persons inside and outside of the organization. We help students see that when they teleconference with their corporate or nonprofit organization to brainstorm before going away, when they developed their proposal plan, when they had to change their proposal plan because when they arrived on project site, they realized that the needs changed of the organization or the resources they thought they had were different. They all write a significant page report that also gets published on our library website. They all present to their sponsors and one another. So these are all great experiences that students get from their project-based experiences, and we help students coach them on the skills that they've gotten from their experiences that tie to these top 10 skills. And then we talk about how you can go and kind of add that to your resume. So what we really do with each student is ask them what their specific career goals are, and then we help them through reflective dialogue as to where is the best place for it on your resume. So for example, if they were applying for a role that had a location where they studied, and that was really important to them, then maybe in their objective being in that global company is really important to them. Most of our students are going to put their experience in our project section. which is a great way for students to leverage what they did, how they did it, what they used, their team skills, the fact that it was an interdisciplinary, and oftentimes they're working with students from other universities around the world, and really help them dissect that. And then of course, skills and trying to get students to think about their ability to speak in a business environment within different languages, and then so on. So we really do not have a one-size-fits-all in terms of how to put it on your resume. It's more about asking students through that reflective dialogue, what's the piece you're trying to sell that relates to the roles and organizations that you're looking for. Something else that we do is really help them elaborate on that experience. As much as they can quantify and qualify their experience, we want them to put that on there. And we've gotten pretty comfortable with knowing the questions to ask our students that are going to help them develop that comprehensive entry for their interactive qualifying project or that study abroad experience. And so we know that there's always going to be lacking if they don't mention the team size, if they don't mention if they collaborated with people from different countries, if they spoke in a different language. The report and presentation is going to be there. A lot of our students do qualitative and quantitative research before and during their experience. And so we try to make sure that that's very comprehensive in how they talk about it. And these here are just a few samples from our students as to how we've helped coach them to talk about their experiences on their resume. Now, one thing to definitely note is that we also talk about how you can leverage this in your cover letter. So one of the things that we talk about is when you work with this nonprofit organization or when you were in a different country, what values did you acquire or did align with the work that you did? What are you passionate about? At WPI, we're having this motion of, it's more than just a major, it's your mission. What's your mission? And how has that become developed from your experiences? And then tie those values and those missions and those values to the organization you're applying for. Or if you notice that the company you're applying for has locations overseas, leverage the fact that you did a project over there or that you traveled over there or with the language. Or depending on what part of the US that you're working at, what's the other popular languages in that area, and maybe you've gained that language and you can navigate that. So that's a little bit about how we help students make that connection. Now, we also talk a lot about how to describe their experience, kind of like that compelling storytelling that was mentioned a little bit ago. And we do that, one, by helping students think about their experience, and we might pull up popular behavioral-based questions on an interview, or just questions that they know the employer is going to ask by using resources like Glassdoor or Vault to get a feel for those questions. And then we help them think about how can they talk about their IQP or their study abroad experience that relates to those questions and those things that are really at their core and they really want to be talking about. We help them put it into their elevator pitch. If it was an experience that made an impact on them and they want to leverage that and tell the employer exactly how it relates. Because one of the things that I tell students all the time is that you can't expect an employer to make the connection for you. They're spending 30 seconds on your resume and cover letter, although recently I heard that it's down to 6 seconds. So you cannot let anyone guess that. Plus I say that it's your career and you want to direct your career and don't let anyone guess what it is that you're hoping to do. We talk about the STAR approach. For those of you that are career services professionals, you might have heard of that, but I think it's a great way to help students talk about their overseas experience, where it's a nice formula. I work with STEM students, so we like formulas, and so we visualize in our head, all right, first you're going to set the situation. Where were you? When was it? How many people were there in your group? Then the task, or what was the goal or the piece you're talking about your study abroad or project experience, and how it relates to the question. And then the majority of their answer is focused on the action. And we help coach students on how do you talk about what you did step by step. How did you learn about communicating with people that are from different areas of the world? How did you present to people that might not have that same level of ability as you to know the topic, etc. And so we help kind of coach that out of them. And then the result, positive or negative, does not matter as long as you learn from it. And then my favorite is, how do you tie that back to the experience that you're there for and interviewing for? Whether that's the role, the company, the culture, the recent news of where that company or organization is expanding to. I also coach students on dependable strengths. When you're thinking about your strengths, if you can have at least 3 significant stories about that strength, then that's a dependable one. And helping coach students on, how do you think about different aspects of your experience or incorporating your study abroad experience. And then we do a lot of collaborative programming on campus. I think I'm always still surprised when I hear that there are still some silos that exist, because that is, I am lucky and fortunate that I do not work in an environment like that. So the Global Perspectives Program, or the IGSD, that oversees these programs. We will go into, there's a new exploratory course on a re-entry course. We'll go in and talk to students about, how do you talk about your experience on your resume and interviewing. They have peer-to-peer re-entry seminars every term. I have one of my peer advisors go and talk to them about that NACE activity that I talked about in the beginning. And we wrote and have created tip sheets on how to sell your experience to an employer, so that students that might not want to come in person have some written information to look for. One of the other pieces that our institution is exploring, that I'm on a faculty committee about, is e-portfolios. So we're starting to think about, how do students reflect on their experience, and then I'm going to help them transition. Okay, employers want to know part of your reflection, but they really want to know what's in it for them. How does it go back to helping them be successful, or you to excel in that role? So that's another area. We also work closely with International House that supports our international students. So we partner every November in International Education Month on how to sell your international experience, or how the art of small talk looks different for all of us, and coaching students through that. And then also our office is at all of the every annual global fair, talking about the resources that the Career Development Center can support, as well as all of our examples that we have in programs, workshops, resume samples, all include those overseas experience to help coach students a little bit about how to do that. So I think at that point, it kind of talks a little bit about what that looks like in terms of how we leverage and help students connect their international experience with employers and with the Career Development Center. So I think I'm going to try to go back to the home screen. That was not the home screen. Oh, jeepers. Okay. So thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all the panelists for keeping on time, because we wanted to preserve a lot of time at the end for discussion and your questions. So I'll open up to the floor. So anybody who has any comments or questions?
First of all, that was a really well done presentation. I'm wondering if we can get that PowerPoint someplace, because there was a lot in it that I couldn't take notes on this way.
Yes, the PowerPoint should be up on the app. So if you have the conference app, it should be there and up. Yeah.
I think
it's in the app. Yeah.
So I wanted to say I appreciate the studies that you have been doing, producing data that's helpful for us as we're continuing to advocate for international education on our campuses. I think that's really critical. I think, Anne, one of the shortcomings that you mentioned is that a lot of the data you guys have is self-report data.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, in your experience, are you talking about ways to kind of better assess some of the outcomes of studies abroad that we can add to the...
Well, as Darla Deardorff, who writes all about intercultural competence, she says, the only way to really find out is if it's impossible to do, but that you would go and ask all the people that the student interacts with in the other culture how they did, right? Yeah, that's the way you get the feedback from the other side. But for example, on that, studying abroad impacted my ability to work in diverse workplace, and it's really high percentage, and it's really a lovely statistic. part of me says that, I'm gonna, but you know, even, maybe there's social pressure to answer in a certain way, but you know what? Okay, because then they're showing they know it's important in some way, and you hope that they are striving to, you know, to build their skill in that area. I'm sort of going like with lowest common denominator thing in a way, but do you know what I mean? And so we are trying to do some work. We just developed a piece that our resident directors on site can utilize at the start, like in an orientation thing, to talk about how some of the challenges that you face are opportunity to build skill. And, you know, I was probably, you know, there was some drama in things I talked about when I was that age, and how do you try to instead direct their energy into saying, what am I capable of? You know, and how do I do this? But in terms of assessing their skills, I mean, that's the same thing IIE faces in this study. Yeah, self-report, I mean, it's definitely got shortcomings. On the other hand, there are some questions to which, you know, in the AIFS survey, you know, 98% said they learned about another culture, but only 31%, but still a significant way, said that having studied abroad contributed to their involvement in a civic cause once they got home. So they are being realistic in some way, because they're not, all the answers are not off the charts, right?
Yeah, I guess the discrepancy is, you know, is the self-perception versus actually. And for example, I work at the University of Maryland, and we did an assessment on student perception of their communication skills relative to how employers were rating our students' communication skills. And there's a huge gap there. And
Oh yeah. Oh, there are in the
problematic.
AEC and U studies too. You know, the employers say this and the students say that. Yeah.
Let me add, what I will present for you guys at the end before you walk out. I have a selected bibliography I usually hand out when I do campus workshops. There's now an accumulation over the last 15 years of so much data. And it's hard. I've never seen anybody try to analyze all the different types of questions that have been asked in all of those surveys, you know. But the accumulation of evidence is just overwhelming, frankly. I mean, I think you're right on the one hand. On the other hand, now that there have been so many different types of surveys, often of really large cohorts, coming to very, very similar conclusions about impact. So I don't think there's anybody who would question, who could question impacts and value added at this point in time. You perhaps could begin to say that one could question the validity of certain types of surveys that are done casually, and where people don't take a lot of time to adequately have a large cohort that they're collecting data from, and cast those aside. In whatever way you would cast aside poorly constructed surveys, there's still too many around, some national, like in Australia, to deny that these impacts are real for the majority of students. They're more, the thing to say about this is they're more real. The impacts are more real, if you could say that, for students who have been more thoughtful and purposeful about deciding to go. There's evidence about that.
And in this study.
Yes. So that's where, and you circle back with that truth in hand to say, yes, and therefore we need to take charge of how we prepare students. The more we get students to appreciate certain kinds of considerations in their decision making. I agree with Ann when she said, whether or not a student carefully is considering the career impact before they go may or may not, you know, interfere with their having a great experience and impactful experience. And yes, if they have that career direction in mind, in some measure, the impacts are greater. But what there is no doubt about, also there have been increasingly large cohorts of alumni of programs many years afterwards, where the question was asked, and were you thinking about your career prospects at the time you were an undergrad and went abroad? And they'd say no. Has it made a difference in the advancement of your career? Yes. And then they delve into the how, right? So there's also been impactful elements to analyses of international experience, maybe 5 to 10 years after a student graduates in their career advancement process.
Following up on your point and Ann's point, that when Ann talked about how the Vandenberg and Trudeau study, the contemporary students, and all, that's where you were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Having been in the field the 3 times now, I think it's important to contextualize the kind of meta-historical process that study abroad has gone through. We're in an era of democratization and massification, whereas 10 years ago, we were just linking the practical aspects of employability and everything else, because 30 years ago, it was all, we were kind of on this elitist track of either, kind of a finishing school for elites in the Ivies, or someone in, the research publics looking for a career in the State Department or, being a professor in history. And so the rationales were very different then. And so when we asked those alums that went through the process 30 years ago, were you thinking about that? No one thought about it. Either that, or they were thinking, where am I going to land in the State Department, or am I going to teach African history or Middle Eastern history or something like that? I think we're in a so much better place now. There's room for that original model, and we're just seeing a diversification in the outcomes. And I mean, the work that you guys are doing are absolutely fabulous, because we can now democratize the process, because we know intuitively that there are good things for everybody there, but we have a greater degree of intentionality.
Yes.
So I think that's really healthy. So that's all you guys.
I want to just add a comment to that. I was thinking as everybody else was presenting that, really in the world of study abroad now, experiential learning and internships and things like that have really come to the forefront and are really growing in popularity. So I'd love to ask the panelists and even everybody in the room sort of where you see the value of sort of the academic, sort of classroom-based study abroad versus the more experiential learning for study abroad, and where the value and the connection is between those 2 different forms for employability and transferable skills.
I think the act of going anywhere has experiential value. I mean, off campus. It could be community service in another state. It could be volunteering abroad and study abroad. But just the act of being out of your home classroom in a purposeful way has great value. I think there are studies, the research, as I said earlier. I mean, if you can combine being in a classroom abroad with some other form of community-based experiential learning, I think that has great added value. As I mean, in these circles here that we're in, and NAFSA circles, there isn't a lot of use of the term experiential learning necessarily, as much as there used to be. But I have never lost, largely because of my own life story, when I was at my first grad school at SIT, which remains highly experiential in its curriculum. But when I was, and everybody I know who's ever been through SIT, through all these eras where we've lived through in higher ed, the changes, massification, all the other things that have gone on, experiential learning remains at the heart of, for me, the value for a student of their undergraduate life. And it's just any way, for some students, going to college, and let's not lose sight of the fact that for many students, going to college in and of itself has great impact, right? I mean, that's what's different now because of the diversification in higher ed than where we were decades ago. And I would also add, just as a note, maybe a footnote here, but it isn't so talked about, but race and class have everything to do too with impacts. And some of the surveys and some of the work that's gone on really doesn't pay sufficient attention to impacts in that way.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I think WPI is doing a great job at is our flexibility. So, sometimes in other schools, students might have to choose between doing a co-op and doing a study abroad experience. At WPI, every student gets to do whatever experiences they want. Projects are required. Every student is required to do this project, with that goal being of 90% doing them off campus. But then our students are doing co-op and study abroad or IQP and still graduating early even. So it's all about picking the experiences that are important to you and then leveraging that to the employer. One of the things that we're doing of increasing our co-op program is to tell students, you could earn $20,000 to $28,000 on co-op. Great way to help fund your project experience overseas. So why not do that experience, get some of those skills, earn some money, and then you're able to have more opportunity to choose different project centers that, we're trying to lower that barrier and increase our return on investment.
I just have two quick thoughts on that. One of them is that truly for very many years, I've conducted a lot of sessions with returned students and thinking about the skills they developed. And I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you, and you probably do the same. I mean, they're never talking about their academic content as, the place where they develop skill. And yet, I think it's important that we deliver some academic content. On the other hand, in the last couple minutes, it made me think, well, what about our own education system here with regard to experiential education? And if that's what's building skill, when they go abroad, how come we're not paying more attention to that here, right here at home?
I just wanted to echo what Karen said. I don't think it's an either or. If you studied abroad and you were in a classroom with a professor from a different background, let's say French speaking, that's a whole different delivery versus if you're in an island program with fellow American students. So I think it really is what is the experience and what is the environment that it's in.
Yes.
That's delivered versus do I get 20 credits for this versus 5?
Yeah.
So I think it's not either or, but really the experience.
Right. And a lot of the skill stories with regard to academics in some ways, they certainly can be about adapting to a different academic system, right?
Christine, I had a question about your study. I work with some programs that support professionals, and I assume that the data you collected are primarily students of traditional age. Did you collect data on their age? And if you had to surmise, how much do you think the competencies gained with students would also apply to professionals?
So we surveyed study abroad alumni. So many were working as professionals. They had, by and large, all of them studied abroad as undergraduates. So we weren't looking necessarily at the overseas training of professionals, but we were looking at people who studied abroad as long ago as about 15 years ago. So most of the people in our study were working in a professional field currently. So the findings of our study really do apply to people working as professionals, reflecting back on their study abroad experience and how that relates to their current careers.
So in other words, you were asking whether at the time they were going abroad, they were traditional
Right.
age.
Perhaps someone is 30 when they have their experience abroad. Would you surmise that some of the competencies gained would also be gained as a professional if that was one of their experiences? And I recognize that's not your study, but based on what you read, would you surmise some of that's applicable or no?
That's a really interesting question. I'm just thinking about just the conversation we're having now is that it's the experience. So I would surmise that, if professionals are going abroad with, the intention of gaining certain, skills through that education abroad experience, that they would gain similar outcomes. I would even venture to guess, and this isn't really a guess, that, they might even be a bit more intentional and would come into that experience knowing what skills they already have in the professional world and knowing what they wanted to obtain, to further themselves. I was also thinking that, when students go abroad and then they go looking for a job, they don't really quite understand what skills are needed in the workforce. Right? They haven't had necessarily a big, long work history. They haven't really applied any of their skills in the workforce yet. So I think that's probably a big challenge, just, when you're graduating, with your bachelor's degree, looking for a job, that there's probably just an overall challenge, regardless of whether you're talking about study abroad experience, there's an overall challenge in understanding what skills employers are really looking for and what I bring to that. But for professionals, I think they, who have already that professional experience and that work experience, that they would be have maybe more reflection and more real insights into what skills they have and what they would be looking to develop.
I would say the only thing I can think of in the United States, certainly now all these decades after Peace Corps was founded, I mean, I'm not aware, I used to be more in touch with this, but I don't know what current research they've done longitudinally, but they certainly have a terrific cohort of all range of age that's completely atypical for any kind of voluntary service program in the United States. Maybe they've conducted research about impacts on the vast range of individuals. The anecdotal stuff you hear all the time, of course, is phenomenal. How many Peace Corps volunteers are in this room? Yeah, and I mean, most people I know, I didn't do Peace Corps. Everybody I know who has, no matter what age they are at, it's like the singular, most powerful, like our friend from IBM. Single most powerful experience that may have occurred because it's 2 years. I mean, no one studies abroad for 2 years. The only it's still in any sort of experiential format, Peace Corps remains the type of service you could have in the United States, which would be of such tremendous length, and that's why it's such a valuable thing to be analyzing in terms of impacts.
Yeah. I think this is, I know a lot of the questions that have been asked and some of the things that were mentioned this morning. Gina Tessa, when she talked about her experience this morning and talked about IBM, what she says is that they're looking for skills that are built through experiences like study abroad. And so you sort of pointed out that the evidence is pretty robust that this is impactful, but is there anything that's differentiating the ways in which those skills are being built in, whatever, co-ops or service learning experiences or working plus school, that kind of thing? In short, what is if we're focused on these skills employers, what's the pitch for abroad?
As opposed to some other type of experiential learning?
All these other
Yeah.
things.
I mean, you can have an intercultural experience and do a good internship, and that's really attractive to a U.S. employer, right?
Yeah.
Well, I am familiar with the service learning field. There was a time when it was called the National Society for Internships and Experiential Learning, and then they cut out the I. It's still the National Society for Experiential Education, rather, NSE. And that's where service learning has been housed professionally with it. And I'm not aware of what current research is going on there, but that exists for many. I was on the board in 1981. It's been around a long time on that side of service learning. But you're right. Just to say, I think, again, I've never seen any research which tries to correlate impact across types of experiential learning.
I was also just thinking in terms of collaboration, right? I saw the collaboration. There was one of those was career services and these global, and I forget what the other buildings.
International.
But like that collaboration could also be with your Center for Civic Engagement and Community Involvement. Those.
One thing that we tell students is it's a great differentiator, their study abroad experiences, in connecting with the company and where the company exists, the industry they're in, the locations they're expanding to, the different languages spoken in that workforce or on the manufacturing floor per se. And so a lot of times their overseas experience and the projects that they're doing and the values that they've gained and what they've learned about themselves they can leverage a lot more in why, you know, this company culture, this industry, or, you know, yes, I'm okay with relocating, you know, to X, Y, and Z because I've done it and I've gained that skill set.
So we are at time. I want to thank everybody for attending today, and thank the panelists for all your great questions.
I want this.
The slideshow is not on the app that I saw.
Okay. I'll talk to my colleagues and make sure it gets up on the app. But if you have any concerns, come up and I'll happy to take your card and make sure you get the presentation.